Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this session tonight. My name is Peter Larson. I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I'm happy to have with me Michael Lynk, Professor Michael Lynk from Western University, a law professor, and for our purposes today, most relevantly, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Tonight's session will be on Israel at the UN and why Israel so frequently comes in for criticism at the UN. Some people worry that maybe it's because of anti-Semitism or somehow unfair. And so Michael and I will try to discuss why it is that Israel is so frequently criticized at the UN. Before I delve into that, this is one of a series of webinars that my organization, the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, has been organizing basically since the beginning of COVID. We used to do public meetings in Ottawa, and now we've been doing webinars. We try to do them every month, bringing expert speakers in to talk about the Israel-Palestine issue. Our next meeting will be in mid-January, and it'll be focusing on Jerusalem. In particular, it'll be focusing on an official Israeli program, which is called the Judaization of Jerusalem. That's officially Israeli government program. Or the Palestinians see it as the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, the transforming of Jerusalem, which is an ancient multicultural and multi-religious city, into one that's overwhelmingly Jewish and the capital of Israel. So we have two professors talking from Jerusalem in January. I'll be sending an email about that. One is the Dean of Women's College in East Jerusalem, and the other is a professor who runs a human rights clinic in the Old City in Jerusalem. So I'm going to, the way Michael and I are going to do this today, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to share a screen in a moment, and we'll walk through it, and the two of us will try to discuss the points that come up in the PowerPoint. So if I got this right. There. Just make sure, Michael, you're confirming that you're seeing that? Is that on your screen?
I can see it clearly.
Okay, great. Okay. So as I say, the session today is why does the UN always single out Israel for criticism? And for Michael Lynk and myself are going to be presenting it today. Now, one of the things that, as I say, it's often mentioned here as a headline from the Times of Israel, pointing out that the UN condemned Israel 17 times in 2020 versus 6 times for the rest of the world combined, which on the face of it sounds quite extraordinary. And it's not just the Times of Israel that says it. If you look at the statistics, the UN, in fact, does criticize Israel more than any other state. And going back here to 2012, you can see the relative numbers, resolutions relating to Israel versus resolutions relating to the rest of the world. And the numbers around Israel are around 20, and we'll come back to why that's the case again. Is it true that the UN only votes against Israel? No, you can see the other list of other resolutions. And in fact, even Canada came in for some criticism, appropriate criticism, I would say, on our human rights records with respect to our indigenous people. So it's not only Israel that gets criticized, but Israel gets criticized more than any other country. That criticism tends to take place in the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly is arguably the most representative body in the world, 190 some countries representing 8 billion people. And so when a vote gets taken at the UN, we can safely say that it represents world public opinion. But at the same time, it's also a bit of public theater. Even countries with quite bad human rights situations themselves are happy to criticize other countries or point their finger at Israel. So, for example, in this 1975 resolution, Is Zionism Racism?, which was passed at the UN by 72 to 35. At the same time, you have to take that with a grain of salt because some of the countries passing that resolution may have themselves not been exemplary. But now, the UN and Israel have a special relationship, and I'm going to ask Michael to help us go through this. I have some quotes from the UN and some quotes from Kofi Annan. Michael, can you help us decode this, what we have here?
Sure. What you have at the top is the UN has a permanent responsibility towards the question of Palestine until the question is resolved in all its aspects. That was in a December 2020 resolution, which was passed overwhelmingly in the General Assembly. And I believe that this wording has been in a number of prior UN General Assembly resolutions. And you have to remember, if you go back, and I know you will go back, and so I'll mention it briefly here, is that it was the United Nations that in fact gave the birth certificate to Israel by Resolution 181 in November of 1947, which where two states were to be created, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state in the land of Mandate Palestine. Only one of those states came into being. And the UN has said, and you can see in the quote from Kofi Annan, which is in his memoirs from 10 years ago, that as he says, the failure to achieve an Israeli-Palestinian peace remains for the UN a deep internal wound as old as the organization itself. Indeed, the United Nations was only 2 years old when it took the decision to partition Palestine into two states. I should say, against the wishes of the indigenous and overwhelming majority of people living in Palestine at that time. And he goes on to say, no other issue carries such a powerful symbolic and emotional charge, affecting people far from the zone of conflict. This is a quote I've often used when I talk about the relationship between the United Nations and the question of Palestine. And it's not only Kofi Annan who said this. A more recent column by Ban Ki-moon, his successor, in June of 2021, expressed very similar feelings. Brian Urquhart, some of you who may have served in the international UN system who are listening to this today would know his name as the Undersecretary of State for a number of years in the 1970s and 1980s. And he said in his memoirs that the issue of Palestine and the unresolved question has torn apart the organization in a way that no other conflict has.
Thank you, Michael. Something I should have mentioned earlier is you have the possibility in the audience to use both the chat function and the Q&A function. We won't be able to keep an eye on the chat function, so that's where the audience can share views or send notes to the participants, so that won't happen as long as we're using the share screen. But please ask your questions in the Q&A, and when we're finished our presentation, Michael and I will go through the questions and see if we're able to answer any of them to your satisfaction. So Michael mentioned the fact that the UN created in Israel, Palestine in the partition in 1947, and that came out of a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. When I started doing this work on the Israel-Palestine issue, I was surprised to see that Jews had been expelled from England in 1290 or Wales in 1290, and various parts of France in 1100. And these expulsions of Jews and the mistreatment of Jews happened in the Christian countries. There was nothing like it anywhere else in the world. In the Muslim countries, the Zoroastrian countries, the Hindu countries, it was for some reason, Christianity was very intolerant of Jews and Judaism. And there were many Jews who were massacred during the Crusades. And for some reason, Christianity had a particular antipathy towards Jews. And this is true of both Catholics and Protestants as well. And when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, the Jews and Muslims were expelled from Spain in 1492, many of them fled to the Muslim parts of the world. Suppression of Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, became very intense in the 19th century. You can see here a list of the areas where there were pogroms in Eastern Europe, which is Ukraine, Russia, and so on. And the Jews as a people reacted to it in various ways. The biggest way, most of them emigrated to America. There was huge Jewish immigration to America. Some Jews thought that the answer was in socialism and revolution or communism. And as we know, people like Trotsky and so on were very involved in the Russian Revolution. But a third notion was that Jews would have to have a state of their own. And this was articulated first by a man named Theodor Herzl, who wrote a book called The Jewish State, the idea that somewhere in the world, for their own protection, the Jews need a state of their own.
Peter, if I can just,
please,
before you leave that slide, if I can just say, I think there was a fourth tendency as well, which is liberalism, where there were, and this is the most successful, obviously, in Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, where Jews fought to be able to have the same rights and remove any disabilities for themselves as Jews, both individually and as community, in order to be able to enjoy the I guess the franchises of that liberal democracy that was understood in the 19th century. So to the three reactions by Jews to the persecution, anti-Semitism they would have faced in Europe, I would add the fourth as well.
Good point. That the Jews, up until 1848, Jews who lived in Germany were not officially citizens. The emancipation of Jews happened in 1848. It happened in the French Revolution as well. But you're right; they were not able to integrate into the society prior to that. This horrible trend became exacerbated with the Holocaust, and it culminated in the Holocaust. First, a desire by the Nazis to ethnically cleanse Germany of undesirable people, especially expelling Jews, and then it moved to, we all know as the final solution, which was this terrible tragedy of the murder of upwards of 6 million Jews, and of course another 9 million undesirables of one sort or another. And the Holocaust moved, of those options, moved the Zionist solution, the idea that Jews need a state of their own, to the top of the agenda. There was horror and shame over the Holocaust, but there was also anti-Semitism. In Canada, we didn't want the Jews to come here. So the Zionist idea of sending Jews to Palestine became very popular. Many people watching the slides here will remember the terrible story of the St. Louis that was sent back. This is in June 1939, sent back a boat full of Jewish refugees sent back to Hamburg, where many of them subsequently killed. But even in the 40s, there was still intense anti-Semitism in Canada. Queen's University, for example, limited Jewish enrollment. And I believe that's true of other Canadian universities as well. So as a result, the horrors of the Holocaust pushed the Zionist idea to the fore. And this was the notion that Jews should have a homeland. This became the dominant view amongst Jews, but it also became very popular in the West. And it turns out that Britain had controlled Palestine, and so it seemed to make a good fit for them, as to help Jews move to Palestine. And so Zionism was a European solution to that European problem of anti-Semitism. Michael, you want something to add on something here?
Well, I'm not sure if I can't remember if there's a slide that's coming up with respect to this, but the important point to point out is that 1917 marked several important trends with respect to Palestine. First, 1917 was when the British Army of the East wound up removing and pushing out the Turkish Ottoman Empire and the troops out of Palestine, out of what was then Transjordan, and out of Syria as well. So the British took over and were eventually granted a mandate by the League of Nations 5 years later. But 1917 also marks the Balfour Declaration. But at the time when the Balfour Declaration was issued in November of 1917, the population of Palestine was around 740,000 people. 93% of that population were Arab Palestinians, both Christians and Muslims. There was a small population, a very long-standing population of Jews, somewhere in the range of 6 to 7%. Some of whom have been there for centuries. Some of whom have been arriving since the 1870s and 1880s in small numbers, particularly from Eastern Europe and from Russia. But when the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, there was no consultation with the Palestinian Arab majority living in Palestine as to what should happen to their land. They were glad to be free of Ottoman rule, and they were looking forward, as were other countries in that area, to emancipation and the realization of Woodrow Wilson's promise of self-determination.
Michael, if I'm not mistaken, eventually the British gave independence of a sort to Jordan and to Iraq and so on, but not to Palestine. Palestine remained a British protectorate, is that a British mandate? That's right?
That's correct. There was nominal independence with a great deal of British control for Iraq and for Transjordan, and this became particularly important when oil was discovered in Iraq in the years between the two world wars. Syria and Lebanon fell under French mandates, but Britain received the mandate for this area, and they had promised to use it to fulfill the Balfour Declaration that a Jewish homeland would be established in Palestine.
So in the wake of the war, the UN adopted the Zionist idea that they could take part of Palestine and give it to the European Jews who were fleeing oppression. And that resolution, as Michael said, is called Resolution 181. It was on November 29th, 1947. The UN itself was created in October 45, something like that, Michael, is that?
That's correct.
That's right. And that resolution divided what had been British mandate Palestine into three, basically, into a Jewish state, an Arab state, plus a neutral zone around Jerusalem under UN auspices, recognizing that Jerusalem was this very important city to the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And you can see on the map the green area. I know Michael is much more expert than I. He pointed out this is not exactly the right map. This is the best one I could find. It's a pretty good approximation. The green area was to be part of the new Jewish state. The brown area was to be part of the new Arab state. And you can see the white area around Jerusalem, which was to be this place under UN auspices. And when that voting took place, 33 countries voted for, 13 voted against, and 10 abstained. Michael, you might want to explain the voting a little bit. What is the significance?
Sure. Well,
of that?
I think the most important thing to realize at this time is that the UN of 1947 is not the UN of 1980 or the UN of today. It had around 54 members, less than 30% of what the membership is today. It was primarily made up of states from the global north, many of whom had empires and colonies abroad. So the idea of creating, if you like, a settler colonial state in Palestine, both to address the Jewish question and to, I suppose, to demonstrate European remorse for the horrors of the Holocaust. That price was paid by the Palestinians. Even at the time of the vote in November 1947, the population was around Peter says 1.5 million. My figure suggests around 1.2 million. But the Palestinian population was still about 2/3 of the population of Mandate Palestine. They did not want to see a division of their country. They had been pushing since the 1920s for a representative legislature in Palestine that would represent their views, and their views very strongly, no matter how you measure it, was against the division of the country. They want, and probably against the influx of Jewish refugees coming from Europe. They wanted to have an Arab Palestine state, which is what they thought they were promised in the aftermath of the First World War. Even by anybody's reckoning, the partition plan that was created by the United Nations, Peter has the map that was, as of August 1947, another map was created with a vote in November 1947, but you had 2/3 of the population being given around 44% of the land. You had the population of 1/3, by this time, 1/3 of the population were Jews, primarily European Jews who had migrated either in the 30s or in the aftermath of the Second World War, being given 54% of the land. And they had only owned about 7% of the land at the time of the vote in 1947. The Jewish state in turquoise there, or blue, had the best ports. They had some of the best agriculture in Palestine, and they had a significant part of the seacoast, as well as the bulk of the Galilee. So Peter, I think you probably have a subsequent map of what happened after 1947.
Yeah, I do. But I wanted to, but before I got that, I want to just go over some of the provisions that were in that resolution, Michael. Provisions that amounted to protection. The UN resolution amounted to protection for the Palestinians who were living there. Do you want to just quickly review those three?
Sure. I mean, these are what were embedded in the resolution partition from November 1947, and it stated that the constitutions of both the designed Palestinian state and the Jewish state should contain these, I guess, cornerstones of modern liberal democracy and the rule of law with respect to this. I should point out one other thing, Peter, which I forgot to mention with respect to the division in November 1947. The Jewish state that was created on 54% of the land, or what was to be created, the population of that was a majority Palestinian population. It was around 400, almost 500,000 Jews would be in that state. And something close to 600,000 Palestinian Arabs were going to be in that state. So both the Palestinian state was an overwhelmingly majoritarian state on the division of the partition, but even the Jewish state would have been a majority Palestinian state. I think the aspirations of the leaders of the Yeshiv, the Jewish community in Palestine at that time, was that population by immigration of Jews coming from Europe would wind up tipping the balance with respect to that.
Okay. So then the question is, well, what happened after the UN vote? And as Michael said, in order to have a Jewish state, the Jews had to be in the majority, but the Jews were only a third of the population in 1947. So they had a problem, and there are really only two options. One is to expel the Palestinians or encourage immigration of Jews. And in fact, they did both. Starting the day after the UN vote, armed Zionist militias started expelling the Palestinians. This was not an accident. This was not something of a misunderstanding. This was an absolute requirement if they were going to create a Jewish state in a place where most of the people were not Jewish. And in the next 16 months, about 750,000 of Palestinians were expelled, and they left all their possessions behind, and they were confiscated by the state of Israel. So Ben-Gurion, on behalf of the Jewish Agency, publicly welcomed the UN plan, but the Zionist militias actually went way, way beyond its provisions. If you look at the maps on the left-hand side, the far left is more or less a map of what the UN proposed. That was the map that we've seen earlier. But by the time the fighting stopped, the Zionist forces had taken over much, much more. Instead of taking over 55%, they'd taken over 78%, and it expelled 750,000 Palestinians. And you can see on the map on the right-hand side where those Palestinians fled to, north to where they fled wherever they could. They fled to Lebanon, they fled to Jordan, or they fled down to Gaza, some to Egypt, and so on. And the Jewish forces also took over Jaffa. Now, Jaffa was an interesting case because you see Jaffa here in the map. Jaffa was actually, it was the largest Palestinian city at the time. It was a port, and the Palestinians obviously wanted to keep it, but the Zionists wanted it. So they took over Jaffa and expelled people. And many of the people that fled to Gaza, for example, came from Jaffa. Jaffa now, of course, is integrated into Israel, but that's not what the UN plan allowed for. Michael, do you want to speak to this slide?
Well, yes. There were a number of ceasefires that have been called by the UN in trying to administer this, and there were several ceasefires were held, but they would never last for very long. Remember that even at the time of the creation, the Declaration of Independence by the State of Israel in the middle of May of 1948, by that time, you've mentioned the figure of around 750,000 Palestinians had been expelled during the course of the war. Over 300,000 had already been expelled even before the formal declaration of the State of Israel. There was a plan in the fall of 1948 by the then Swedish mediator, Count Bernadotte, that would become the basis of a subsequent resolution, 194, where he said it was important to be able to give the right of Palestinians who had fled or had been expelled from 1947 through 1948 and into 1949, the right to be able to return to their homes.
But we'll come on to that resolution in a minute, Michael.
Sure. Okay. So, well, what you have with respect to this, obviously the 78% of the land was taken. There were agreements between the fledgling Israeli leadership and the King of Jordan at that time, King Abdullah, that he would be able to keep what would become known as the West Bank in exchange for, I guess, for a soft truce between the two, and that's exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. It didn't appear that the Israelis had any intention of allowing a Palestinian state, and King Abdullah of Jordan, had no intention of allowing a Palestinian state as well. So he assumed the other 22% of Palestine at that time.
So, sort of, just to summarize here, the UN passed a resolution that gave part of Palestine to a Jewish state, but it also had a number of qualifications in it, and those were not adopted by Israel. So, for example, while it adopted the part of the UN resolution that gave it a Jewish state, it took over Jaffa, which was not supposed to do. It took over West Jerusalem, which it was not supposed to do. It took 78% of the land instead of the 55% proposed by the UN. Mm-hmm. It did not respect the rights of the Palestinian citizens, the Palestinians who became citizens of Israel. Yeah. Expelled 325,000 people. It confiscated their property, once again, against the UN resolution, and didn't allow them to return. So we're getting now to understand better why it is that the UN is so frustrated with Israel, that Israel took part of the resolution that it liked and then ignored the parts that it didn't like.
You said it well.
So now we have the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and I think this is important to pay attention to, because this is sometimes referred to, people argue that there can't be discrimination in Israel because the Declaration of Independence says that the state will ensure complete equality of social and political rights. This is Ben-Gurion and his Declaration of Independence, political rights to all of its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It guarantees freedom of religion, language, education, and culture. And it said it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So this is Israel speaking to the United Nations. What a lot of people don't realize is that the Israeli Declaration of Independence is not Israeli law. You can compare it to the American Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal. But the founding fathers of America had a big debate about whether or not they wanted to include equality in the American Constitution, because of course they had slavery. So the Israeli Declaration of Independence was kind of a promise of what we wanted to have, but it did not become law, and it was part of the promise that Israel put to the United Nations.
If I can add to that, Peter, yeah. I believe in the Declaration of Independence, Israel notes, makes explicit reference to Resolution 181, I believe 11 times. Kofi Annan in his memoirs called 181 the birth certificate for Israel.
But that's the partition resolution you're talking about.
But the partition resolution, but obviously it had a skewed interpretation of right. What 181 meant for it.
So then, having passed this resolution, the UN now watches this unfold, and it doesn't unfold the way it anticipated, particularly around the resolution. So around the expulsions. So how did the UN react to the expulsions, Michael?
Well, in September 1948, as Count Bernadotte, the Swedish mediator, was completing his final draft of his report to be submitted to the United Nations. He wrote, among other things, that you see there, Palestinian refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practical date. I think within 48 hours of he writing this, he had been assassinated by Jewish militia members. The report was submitted to the United Nations, and this became the basis of Resolution 194 in December 1948, which had a number of stipulations in it, including allowing the right to return in language that closely adopted what Count Bernadette had written in his September report.
Nonetheless, in May 1949, Israel was admitted to be a member of the United Nations. And its admission was based largely on these promises that Israel had made, that it would unreservedly accept the obligations of the United Nations Charter and undertakes to honor them from the day when it becomes a member. This resolution also recalled the resolutions of November 1947, which was the partition, and the 11th of December 1948, which was the right of return. And on that basis, the UN said, okay, we will admit Israel to membership. And on the grounds that it seemed that Israel was accepting the 1947 borders and accepting the principle of the right of return. Is that the way you see it, Michael?
Yes, of course. There were substantial obligations that were, I think, accepted by Israel as a means of being admitted to the United Nations in 1949. That was an important diplomatic step for Israel to acquire that. And to do that, it made these promises that resolutions 181 and 194 and the Charter of the United Nations would wind up being followed. On the basis of those promises and submissions, the UN voted, as you see, overwhelmingly to admit Israel into membership into the UN.
Okay. Since that time, however, Israel has continued to ignore the borders that were proposed by the UN. In fact, it's continued to expand its borders, as we know, in the West Bank. It's refused to accept the UN principle of the right of return, and it's confiscated the property of the refugees. It has ignored the declaration that all citizens would be equal. In fact, most recently, it declared itself a Jewish state in which Jews have more rights than non-Jews. And it's physically and even militarily prevented Palestinians from returning. This picture down at the bottom on the right-hand side is from the Great March of Return from 2015. Palestinians, 2018. So, thank you. This picture is taken from the Israeli side with their tanks and tear gas launchers, and on the other side you have Palestinians clamoring for their right to return to Israel. In the net of it, over 200 Palestinians were killed and tens of thousands were injured. So when Israel says that we don't want the people to return, they mean it, and that's in violation of the UN, their agreements to the UN.
Yeah, and I should point out that Resolution 194, with the right to return, has actually been passed virtually every year since by the United Nations. It's one of the most readopted, or reaffirmed principles of the United Nations from the 1940s right until 2020. That this has been made, and the right of refugees to be able to return to their homeland, is now embedded in the Convention on the Rights of Refugees, adopted by the United Nations in 1951, inspired in part by the resolutions that were passed with respect to Palestinian refugees in 1948 and 1949. So every refugee in the world has the right, has three choices of which they have the individual right to make: the right to stay where they are, the right to be able to seek asylum in a third party state, or the right to be able to return. But the right to be able to return is a fundamental cornerstone of modern international law, and that applies to the Palestinians as much as it applies to refugees from Rohingya or from Sudan or anywhere else in the world.
So, Michael, we're getting here towards an important observation that the UN every year votes these same resolutions over and over again on the right of return and so on, and Israel keeps ignoring them. So when the Israelis complain that we are being criticized all the time, why do you criticize us all the time? It reminds me of a parent who says to his or her son, clean up your room. And the son says, yes, I'll do that. And then the next day they haven't done it. They clean up your room again, and clean up your room again. And he says, well, why are you criticizing me all the time? Well, it's because you didn't do what we said to do. And that's one of the reasons why there is over and over again, usually 16 resolutions that go to the UN every year, for which the voting is overwhelmingly critical of Israel, not unanimously, and we'll come to that in a moment.
Keep in mind, and I'm not sure if you're going to be heading to this or not, Peter. So if you think I'm stepping into an area where you're going to be covering my slides, but you got to remember there are three principal United Nations bodies, representative or quasi-representative bodies. Yes, it's the United Nations General Assembly, which is the most representative body in the world. And it passes resolutions every year in December that are critical of Israel. That are
I think they're sitting right now, Michael.
They are
right now. Yes.
Right, but the foundation of it is that these resolutions are all deeply rooted in international law. Israel, you're not allowed to annex territory, such as East Jerusalem or the Syrian Golan Heights. Israel, you're not allowed to put civilian settlements into occupied territory. Israel, you're not allowed to build a wall on occupied territory. Israel, there are a stream of human rights violations, such as settler violence or home demolitions, of which are contrary to stated principles in international human rights law and international humanitarian law. These are what the gist of the resolutions are that are passed. And I think the big issue is not the fact that they're passed, the issue is that they're not obeyed. And the same thing happens with respect to the Human Rights Council as well. And I hope I get a chance a little bit later on to talk about the Human Rights Council, which is where my mandate emanates from. But
I'm going to ask you in a minute, Michael, about why it is that all these resolutions don't get implemented. But we'll
okay, fine. Well, then that was what I was going to come to. So why don't you ask me that in a minute then?
Yeah, okay. So this is just a reminder that since 1947, it's not that there's been a stalemate or a status quo. We hear some people talk about a status quo or a stalemate. There is a gradual, ongoing, continuous expansion from the UN plan to the 1949 to the occupied territories now, where more and more construction is going on and the Palestinian land is being more and more constricted. This is not like the First World War, where two nations were facing each other over trenches. This is, from the Palestinian point of view, it's more like the tide coming in. Every day there's a new road, a new house, a new building that they're facing. And it's often, it takes place violently. This is not something that takes, if your house is being torn down, you will resist, and Palestinians do resist. So every 2 weeks, Michael will be aware of this, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which brings out a report every 2 weeks. That's called the Protection of Civilian Report. And this is a 2-week period, 19th of October to the 1st of November. Israeli forces injured 103 Palestinians across the West Bank. They carried out 79 search and arrest operations. On another 27 occasions, they fired warning shots around the perimeter fence of Gaza. They've demolished or seized 22 Palestinian-owned structures. At that time, in that period, settlers injured 4 Palestinians. So this is an ongoing, low-level violence that we don't hear about in the news in Canada.
Yeah, I'll simply say that there was an article in today's Haaretz, the leading liberal daily in Israel, which, using, I believe, UN figures and figures coming from Israeli human rights groups, said that home demolitions, Palestinian home demolitions by Israelis, have reached an all-time record between, I think it was 2015 and 2020. The amount of violence required to sustain the occupation is increasing and increasing dramatically. We see thus from the number of those who were killed during the May war in Gaza. Peter mentioned those who were killed in Gaza in 2018 during the war, during the Great March of Return. But there are dozens of shootings and deaths over the last number of months, particularly in the occupied territories, which barely get reported except through reliable sources like OCHA, the UN agency, that humanitarian agency, which keeps statistics on this. So while at one level, it looks like, well, there's calm in the West Bank. There isn't calm. The expropriation of land continues. Settler violence is reaching an all-time peak, and it's now being debated even within the Israeli Knesset. But the number of deaths of Palestinians is also dramatically on the rise as well. So while it may be calm for Israel and calm for the Israeli settlements, it's anything but calm with respect to the protected population under occupation.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of situations where just last week they announced another 1,300 new construction of new Israeli houses in the West Bank. They'll turn up and start to destroy Palestinian houses that are there. The people start to push back, then the army comes in, then the people start throwing stones at the army, and then the army starts shooting tear gas, and that's how people get killed. And that happens over and over and over again.
Yeah, you've mentioned here in your slide, Peter, with respect to the settlements. I do want to point out or emphasize what's listed there. The settlements are very clear violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the prohibition of an occupying power putting civilian settlements into occupied territory. That has been a cornerstone of international law since the end of the Second World War. That was elevated to a grave breach of international law by the 1977 additional protocol to the Fourth Geneva Convention. In 1998, the world adopted the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, which became law in 2002. And it borrowed the language that was in the Fourth Geneva Convention to say that settlements, civilian settlements placed in occupied territory by the occupying power are war crimes today. And each of the three documents that I've mentioned, the Fourth Geneva Convention, the additional protocol in 1977, and the Rome Statute 1998, have also been adopted directly into Canadian law by the Canadian Parliament. So what are violations of international law and war crimes under international law are also the very same under Canadian law as well.
I remind people that I have, I think, only 2 or 3 more slides to go. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to that very shortly. We just want to cover 1 or 2 more points here. So the question is, after all this, why does the UN single out Israel for criticism? Is it a reflection of bias against Israel? You see the picture on the right here. This is from, I think it may be from B'nai B'rith. I'm not sure. But is the UN biased on Israel? Is the UN anti-Semitic? Or is it just grandstanding by other regimes? Well, I can't discount some of that. I'm sure there may be some anti-Semitism. There may be some other regimes that are grandstanding. But more importantly, it's because the UN created Israel, and the UN feels that it has a special responsibility. And after having created Israel, Israel is in a constant and repeated violator of UN resolutions. And many of those resolutions are repeated every year. Of course, it's also true, and Michael raised this point earlier, it's very unlikely that a resolution like Resolution 181 to create Israel would pass the UN today. It was passed mostly by white European powers, and today the UN is mostly composed of Black and brown third world countries who don't look on colonialism very positively. So I think the UN itself has changed very much. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, if I can just say, I mean, your focus primarily here is on the UN General Assembly. I wanted to mention something with respect to the Security Council.
I'm going to come to. I agree.
Okay.
There's a slide coming up.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
I haven't forgotten it.
Yep.
So every year, as I said, there are 16 motions, and Michael's listed a number of them on the settlements, the right to self-determination, and so on. And then there's a big board here. And this particular one, you can see the yellow one. In this case, Canada has abstained, but overwhelmingly, the votes are against Israel. This 160 to 5 or 6, and the only countries which support Israel are the United States, Canada, Australia, and a couple of Pacific islands. And what reasons does the Canadian government give for voting against, for supporting Israel? Well, they told me I talked to the Director General of Middle East Affairs. They said that, well, there are too many votes against Israel. Well, or that they're one-sided, and it's over and over again. That's all true, that there are lots of votes against Israel, and it's true that it's over and over again. But I think Michael and I have tried to make the case tonight that there is a reason why that's the case. Having said that, all these votes against Israel, why doesn't the UN do anything? Here, Michael, over to you.
Okay. Well, I've mentioned obviously the General Assembly, and I've mentioned the Human Rights Council, but the real decision-making power rests with the Security Council. Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members, which is reflective of the status of where the world stood in 1945. The 5 members being the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China, and 10 members who rotate, who have 2-year terms and who rotate every 2 years, and are chosen by the General Assembly to sit on there. The General Assembly has passed a series of resolutions, I believe around 78 concerning Israel. Certainly, I think they've passed around 30 or 35 since 1967. And the resolutions that the Security Council has passed go to the issues that I've talked about before. They don't go with respect to the refugees, but the Security Council has said on a number of occasions, I believe on 7 occasions, it's declared that the settlements are illegal and a flagrant violation of international law. They said on 22 occasions, I believe, that the annexation of East Jerusalem is null and void under international law. And they said on a number of occasions as well that the 4th Geneva Convention, which is the foundation of the international humanitarian law in cases of occupation, applies in full to the occupied territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Israel is in violation of all of those resolutions, and the gap here is between the proclamation of these various resolutions by the Security Council and its ineffectiveness in wanting to enforce them. And in fact, in his memoir from 2011, Kofi Annan said that he was surprised with respect to, and I think this may have answered something that John Allen raised very quickly, I saw in either the chat or a question and answer, is that he noted that the UN had been very active with respect to Syria, but at the same time, he was astonished by the passivity that the Security Council showed towards its resolutions on Israel. Since February 2009, the United, which is almost 13 years, the United Nations has passed over 700 resolutions during that period of time. It's passed exactly 1 resolution with respect to Israel. That was Resolution 2334 in 2016, and Israel has not been in abeyance with that. Every 3 months, the Security Council has directed the Secretary General to give a report on whether Israel is complying with the requirements under Resolution 2334, passed in December 2016, to stop its settlements, to recognize that the settlements are illegal, and to apply the 4th Geneva Convention in full. And in 20 reports back to the Security Council in those 5 years, the General Assembly, the Secretary General has said on each occasion, Israel is not in compliance. And I'd remind people that Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations says that all member states have to obey decisions of the Security Council. That is a condition for its membership with respect to that. And if I can just quote Kofi Annan with respect to that, he said in his memoirs, even when the Security Council took positions, it did not establish mechanisms to enforce its will. The United Nations wielded its veto to protect the Israelis, even from reasonable international scrutiny and pressure, paralyzing the Council on one of the world's central conflicts, unquote.
So,
Peter.
Michael, thank you. I'm going to now stop sharing the screen, and we're going to get into questions. I see there are already 17 questions in the Q&A. I haven't seen them yet. Maybe you had a chance to look at them, Michael. I would just go to take a quick look.
Okay, and yeah.
Do you see one? Help me here, Michael, because I'm just going through a quick one. Someone asked a question here, what role did Pearson and the other Canadian diplomats play in, well, it says in drawing up the boundaries, but in the partition? Want to answer that, Michael?
Sorry, just repeat that again, please, Peter.
What role did Canada play at the time of partition?
Sure. Canada played two roles, two important figures. Second of being, which is Lester Pearson, who supported the partition of Palestine in 1948, and was, I think, lauded repeatedly in the 1950s for his role in the creation of in the creation of Israel. I should mention also the first dean of my law school, Ivan Rand, was on the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 1947, which was sent to investigate what should be the future of Palestine now that Britain was surrendering its mandate. And he had supported partition as well. And I know that in testimonial dinners through the 50s and 60s, he was called the Canadian Balfour for his role in urging the UN Special Committee to adopt partition as the answer to the dilemma of Palestine.
I see another question, Michael, about the idea that the Israelis accepted the UN partition and the Arabs rejected it. And I want to just say a few words on that. I think if you imagine us Canadians, if the UN decided that, let's say, the Rohingya have been terribly treated and deserved a country, and they're going to give half of Canada to the Rohingya. It's not, I mean, from the point of view of the Palestinians, their country was being given over as a sacrifice to a war and some terrible things that had happened in Europe. But there would have been no division of it that would have appealed to the Palestinians. This is our country. Why are you giving our country to somebody else?
Right. Well, a writer once said, he called the Palestinians the victims of the victims. And I think in many ways that epitomizes, I suppose, the tragedy of the situation. I know there are strong arguments, emotional and political, that Jews, given the dreadful history of persecution that Jews have faced primarily, but not exclusively, but primarily in Europe, deserved a state of their own. And in fact, the reason why, if there is anti-Semitism in the world today, we all recognize that, but it may be a lot worse if there wasn't a Jewish state. And there's an argument and a thread that I think is very appealing with respect to this. But on the other hand, it came at the expense of a people who've been on that land for 1,400 years, living in the vast majority, as a vast majority of the population there, who played no role at all, or virtually no role, with respect to the Holocaust, who were made to sacrifice part and now increasingly all of their country as compensation for what was a European problem. So that's the way in which the issue winds up being debated with respect to this. I see a question from John Allen with respect to fighting both before the Declaration of Independence. And I should say this to all those who are listening, and particularly to John. What we gave you was a 30-minute run through of a very long history, and I didn't mean at all to be able to underestimate or underplay what happened, particularly in the years between 1945 and say 1949, as the storm clouds were gathering over Palestine. Yes, there was fighting between Jews and Arabs prior to the Declaration of Independence between December 1947 and May 1948. But remember that although Jews living in Palestine at that time were a minority, they were outnumbered 2 to 1. They had much better leadership, much stronger institutions, and most importantly, they were much better armed than the Palestinians. The Palestinians had revolted against, I guess, where they saw the destiny of Palestine going 10 years previously in 1936 to 39, and much of their political and social leadership had been killed, exiled, or imprisoned. And they never recovered from that blow, particularly as they went into these gathering storms in between 1947 and 1949. And by the time the Declaration of Independence was declared in May 1948, and the 5 surrounding Arab armies did attack, the over 300,000 Palestinians had already been expelled from areas where planning had been given that they wanted to have these areas as Jewish-only areas.
Michael, a question's been raised here, and I think it's a very important one. Why should Israel, what incentive does Israel have to conform to if the resolutions get passed year after year after year, and as the Canadian government says, it's just theater, it doesn't really mean anything, and that they even know that some of the countries who vote for it themselves got a pretty spotty reputation. Why wouldn't Israel just continue on doing what it's doing?
Well, it is. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Israel has a very powerful diplomatic, military, and economic patron in the United States. And that has protected it against the worst or the most dreadful that, I suppose, from their perspective, that the UN Security Council could wind up doing. The United States has vetoed over 30 resolutions since 1972 or 73 at the Security Council that were critical of Israel, and it ensures that the United Nations Security Council will not take effective countermeasures or accountability measures to compel or require Israel to come into compliance with the UN resolutions on this. And it realizes that it can continue to thicken and deepen the occupation. I mean, the fact that the Israeli settlements are illegal under international law is one of the most widely accepted tenets, diplomatically, legally, and politically, among the modern international community. And yet those settlements continue to grow, defiance of UN Security Council resolutions, and Israel pays virtually no price at all with respect to the occupation. Keep in mind that there is a Palestinian Authority, that there are 5 million Palestinians under occupation in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. But the economic build, particularly for the Palestinians living in West Bank and East Jerusalem, sorry, the West Bank and Gaza, is picked up almost entirely by the international community. Ordinarily under international humanitarian law, it would be the occupying power that pays for the occupation, including all of the institutions of the occupied people, including their healthcare, their social needs, and reviving their economy. That's not the case in Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza. It's the international community who winds up paying. And I fear we're going to be coming close to seeing a new trigger, a great deal of more unrest, as the international donations going to the Palestinians have gone from around 1.3 million in 2011 to around 400 million today. There is growing unrest already.
Sorry, Michael, you say from 1.3 million to 400
$1.3 billion. My apologies, by the UN, by the international community in 2011 to about 400 million today. So there's a significant fiscal crisis in the territories, in the Palestinian territories. The World Bank, in its most recent report last month, listed that certainly in Gaza, unemployment rate is 45%, the poverty rate is 50%, 80% of the population in 2 million people in Gaza are on international assistance. So its economy and a society that's flat on its back. The figures are somewhat better in the West Bank, but the West Bank economy is also beginning to go into a slow collapse as well.
Michael, I'd like to come back to the issue that was, why would Israel pay attention to this? And the corollary is, what enforcement mechanism does the UN have? What's the point? What levers does the UN have to enforce? It could presumably, it could expel Israel from the UN. I mean, that would be a possibility, right? What levers does the UN have?
There have been, I think, in the last 50 or so years, around 30 different sanction regimes created by the United Nations Security Council with respect to countries or situations where there's a conflict zone, where there's human rights violations, and where there's a significant perpetrator with respect to these violations. So
give me an example. Give me an example of why UN.
Starting with Rhodesia, leading up to Myanmar today, areas of Africa, have been under sanctions with respect to all of this. I believe so. This is a strong precedent with respect to this. Yes, Israel would be different in the sense that it's got a European style economy and is a member of a number of important international organizations outside of the UN, such as the OECD. But nevertheless, I mean, the world diplomatically agrees that there should not be an occupation, that there should be a viable Palestinian state on the 1967 boundaries, and that the reason why there isn't is Israel's desire to annex that land, both de jure and de facto. Most modern occupations in the world, Peter, last around 10 to 12 years. Think of the Americans in Japan, or the Western allies in Germany, or even the Americans in Iraq. Those are roughly 10 to 12 years. Those are what the rule of thumb with respect to a length of an occupation. For there to be a 54-year-old occupation with no end in sight, with majority of the West Bank under direct Israeli control in terms of its 300 settlements and its 700,000 Israeli settlers, says that's not an honest policy difference that Israel has in the world with respect to the application of the Fourth Geneva Convention. That's a defiant state that doesn't want to apply it because it has annexation in its sight. So this occupation, I'm afraid, has become indistinguishable from annexation.
Michael, someone raised a technical question. You had earlier on in your presentation talked about 3 decision-making bodies in the UN, but in fact, you only talked, at least to my memory, about the General Assembly and about the Security Council. I think you were going to talk a bit about the third one.
And I'll try to be brief and succinct on this. Yes, my mandate comes from the UN Human Rights Council, which is made up of 47 UN member states who are voted for 3-year terms by the General Assembly. And it has a fairly wide mandate to be able to, to the best of its ability, to protect and promote human rights throughout the world. And I'm part of what is called special procedures. You know, when you talk about the focus on Israel, there are 55 special rapporteurs in the world. Most of them have global mandates. The special rapporteur on the right to food, on the right to housing, on counterterrorism, and so on. And I think there are 12 of us who have specific geographic mandates. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in North Korea, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, in Burundi, in Sudan, and in Belarus, and in the occupied Palestinian territory. So, you know, I guess what you put out in your slides was one very distinct but narrow slice of what the UN winds up focusing on, particularly at the UN General Assembly. Certainly, there are resolutions that are critical of Israel at the UN Human Rights Council, but they've passed resolutions setting up commissions of inquiry with respect to Myanmar, with respect to a number of other states, and they pay close attention to human rights violations throughout the world as they may occur. Yes, there is an increasing focus at the Human Rights Council on Israel. They've just created a special open-ended commission of inquiry on Israel. But this goes to the fact, I think, both to the special responsibility that the United Nations has towards Israel and Palestine, and to the fact that Israel stands as a serial defier of international law and UN resolutions when it comes to ending the occupation.
I'm going to try to deal with Henry Ruskin has argued that there were some gaps in my presentation. Of course, that's true. Couldn't cover that whole history in 24 slides, but basically he has a couple of main points. And one is he feels that I did not sufficiently deal with the fact that Jews were purchasing land in Israel, in Palestine from landlords living outside of Palestine. I think he's raised a point that's very valid. Up until 1947, the European Jewish immigration facilitated by the British was mostly people coming in and buying land. And a lot of the land was bought. Palestine was still a fairly backward feudal society with some rich landlords that owned large pieces of land. Some of those landlords didn't even live in Palestine. If you think of feudal France, where there are counts in Paris, so they had lands all around France. In this case, there were people living in Beirut or living in Cairo or living in Amman that owned land in Palestine. And the lands were bought largely through organizations like the Jewish National Fund that bought up land for immigrant Jews. Where this became very problematic, however, is that the Palestinians had for centuries been living under a feudal kind of land tenure. That is to say, your family got to work the land. And if the land was sold to some other feudal landlord, he would get the taxes, but you would continue to live there. And that was a feudal, that's widely applied in feudal societies across Europe as well. The immigrant Jews were coming in under a British fee simple notion that if you buy the land, then you have the right to take it over and the people who are there have to leave. So from the Palestinian point of view, these immigrants had bought the land from someone else and now they were being expelled. From the point of view of the Jewish immigrants, these folks were being anti-Semitic because they wouldn't let us to take the land that we had bought. And that was one of the huge drivers. Now, after 1947, there was no more purchasing of land. The land was just seized. People were pushed out, driven out. The land was seized, confiscated. There was a authority of confiscated property. I can't remember the exact name of it, but
the absentee property.
Absentee property. And they took over the land and then they allocated it to immigrant Europeans coming in. But you're very right, Henry. It was a significant amount of land. Something like 7% of the land was purchased by immigrant Jews up until 1947. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. Michael?
Well, what this gives rise to is I think we can see certain parallels between the settlement of Canada by European settlers and the settlement occurred in Palestine as well. We've begun that long, painful history to understand and try to reconcile European settlement of land that already had belonged to somebody else. We are recognizing the immense wrongs that were done to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the theft of land, the destruction of societies, the herding of them away from their traditional lands into small reservations and reserves. And we're now embarked upon this journey to figure out how we create a new history together that's going to ensure joint prosperity for everybody. Land acknowledgements are one very small aspect of this. We all recognize that virtually wherever we are in Ontario or in Canada, we're living on land that was once owned and occupied in an Indigenous sense by Indigenous societies. I think there are parallels to be drawn from what journey we've embarked upon here in Canada and what is left to be done with respect to Israel and Palestine. There is virtually no area, no city or town in Israel today or in the settlements in the West Bank which wasn't part of Palestinian land, either as an active community that disappeared in 1948, 1949, or in the farmlands surrounding that. So I saw a very interesting article recently in Haaretz, the liberal Israeli daily, which talked about how difficult it is for many Israeli Jews to consider the idea of what we call now our land acknowledgements with respect to Palestinian land that are lands that were owned by Palestinians up until 75 years ago. So I don't claim that the comparisons are perfect. No historical situation is identical to one another. But as Mark Twain once said, history sometimes rhymes with each other when you look at comparable situations. And I think we can look at comparable situations with respect to settler colonialism in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, and Canada, and see whether or not some of those are not applicable with respect to Palestine as well.
It's interesting you make that comparison. I linked to a comment by Murray Rubin, who points out correctly, I think, that the Palestinians never had a country. When you say country, you mean like a state. And this is sometimes raised as if it meant that they don't have the right to a state if they'd ever had one. But I think as we look at the history of settler colonialism in this country, for example, the Algonquins never had a state, or the Cree never had a state. There are hundreds and hundreds of colonized peoples around the world that didn't have a state. And that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to equality, or that they're not right in trying to preserve their civilization against settler colonialism.
Yeah, I must confess, Peter, I've never understood that argument in view of what we've learned from the long history of colonization and decolonization through the 20th century. I mean, the two great, two of the greatest features of the of the 20th century were the immense, horrible violence that was inflicted upon people, particularly through the two world wars, but not only limited to them, and the process of decolonization and the achievement of liberation by countries predominantly in the global south, and the fact that that many of them didn't have were a state in the modern juridical sense of that prior to colonization didn't mean that they didn't have the right to become a state. And the same thing is true with respect to the Palestinians. I find that argument, quite frankly, rather hollow. With respect to this, and it does show, in fact, the way in which European powers would have gone over the heads of Arabs in the Middle East with the agreements that were created particularly by the French and the British in 1915 to 1920 that took away what Arabs thought they were fighting for in the First World War, was independence, including in Palestine.
Just on a technical point for everybody, someone quite correctly complained that they aren't able to see the chats of other people. That was my error in setting up the pushing the right buttons. I've changed that now. If you go on the right-hand side down at the bottom, you can do a save chat, so you can retrospectively see the chats that other people have made. That wasn't my intention. I'm sorry. That's the way I set things up. Let's see now. I'm trying to focus on questions as much as possible that deal with the UN criticism of of Israel, as opposed to general questions about what Michael might think about Israeli politics, or what he thinks about the Biden administration, and so on. We're looking for ones that pertain particularly to our questions tonight. Actually, here is one that I will pick up that I think is quite important. I don't see who. Robert says, the day after partition, Israel was attacked by 5 surrounding countries and responded. Not all Arabs were expelled. Actually, I think, Robert, I don't have your name exactly. I think you're in error. In fact, the Arab countries did not attack until the British had left, until May 14th, 1948. The day after partition, Zionist forces started to move to push Palestinians out of the areas that they wanted. In fact, there is in Jaffa on the beach, there's a museum called the Museum of the Liberation of Jaffa, where they explain that starting on November 30th, 1947, Irgun forces started to liberate Jaffa. That is to say, drive Palestinians out of Jaffa, notwithstanding the fact that that was supposed to be part of the Arab state according to the UN resolution. That ethnic cleansing operation took place for another 5 months. And by the time that Israel was declared on May 14th, I think, 1948, as Michael said earlier, there were already something like 350,000 Palestinians who had been expelled, and the Zionist forces had gone well beyond the boundaries of what the UN had allocated for the Jewish state. And in fact, as I understand it, and I'm subject to be corrected here, when the Arab countries responded, they never went beyond the lines that were proposed by the UN for an Arab state. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of the case.
Yeah, my understanding, I'm not going to claim to be a scholar of the 1948 war, but my understanding was that the Arab states when they engaged the army or the forces of the fledgling state of Israel, were primarily on territory that had been assigned to the Arab state by the UN resolution in 1947. I think on occasion war was brought into Israel itself. I mean, I think there may have been one or two bombings of Tel Aviv by Egyptian planes, I believe, but the vast bulk of the fighting that did take place between the Arab armies would have been on the territory that had been assigned to the Palestinian state in 1947.
Michael, help me pick a. Here's an important question, I think, by Abigail Absalom Metzger. How much did the claim that the land was the ancient homeland of the Jews and was divinely given to them play into the UN's decision? Okay, there are two parts to that. One is the notion, the religious claim, which I don't know what kind of emphasis that would, certainly for people like Lester Pearson, who was a Canadian at the time. Lester Pearson, according to researcher Eve Engler, was personally a liberal Zionist, believed in the notion of a homeland for Jews. And that was one of the reasons why he was supportive of the notion. But there is no doubt in my mind that Jews have been living in that area for thousands of years, probably 3,000 years. And some of the Jews who were living there were Jewish Arabs. They're Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, and Palestinian Muslims. What changed the situation was this huge immigration of European Jews who didn't speak Arabic, mostly spoke Yiddish, not all. And so from the Palestinian point of view, this was European immigration. This was European colonialism. Michael?
So that certainly would have been the perspective of the Palestinians. As I said before, Palestinians were probably a majority of around 93% of the population in 1917, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, at the time of the British expelled the Ottomans from Palestine. European migration of Jews to Palestine particularly in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism in Germany and the rise of fascist parties in Eastern Europe, meant that by 1947, with a population of around 2 million, I believe, 1.2 million would have been Palestinian Arabs, 650,000 or so would have been Jews living there. The vast bulk of them would have been migrants from there. It's a difficult issue to want to raise, to speak about the issue of continuity of Jews. I mean, I know that there's been a Jewish community probably continuously there for 3,000 years. But in the aftermath of about 2200 AD or modern era, the Jews didn't live as a majority there. With the Islamic conquest in 650, many of the people living in Palestine wound up converting to Islam. There were longstanding Arab Christian communities there as well. So, the claim would be, I mean, and this is why I always find curious, if European Jews could reclaim Palestine after not living there for 2,000 years and had a right, a juridical right that we would recognize, where does that leave the Palestinians who had lived there for 1,400 years and who now wish to want to return from, the refugee camps they live in Lebanon or Syria or Jordan? I don't think we would have, this is why I think what happened in the aftermath of the Second World War was an exception in an era that began as decolonization, that there would have been an allowance of people going from one continent to another to want to live as a majority in place of the indigenous population there. This is something that stands out as an exception, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. But the point I also want to make and hasten to make is, there is now an Israeli Jewish people there. However they came into being, they have rights to be there, along with Palestinian Arabs who have rights to be there as well. And really, we can argue a lot about history, but I'm really interested in wanting to think through how they live together, because both of them love the land, both of them are there and not leaving. And the real question in front of us has to be, how do they wind up living in peace and prosperity with one another, recognizing human rights and the rule of law to guide their relationship? When we see already between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, there are 14 million, almost 14 million Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And there's now either they live in parity, demographic parity with each other, or there's a very slight majority of Palestinian Arabs there. It is an anathema, to any country which calls itself democratic to be ruling authoritatively, in an authoritarian way over more than 5 million people. That has to end. Neither it ends with a genuine two-state solution, where there's two states who have equal juridical rights representing them, or it ends in a one-state democratic feature, which would recognize the equal rights of all and build up a constitution that recognizes, Jewish Israeli rights, Palestinian Arab rights, and finding a creative way for them to govern themselves and to live in prosperity, because neither people are leaving, and that has to be our focus moving forward.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's a good way to move towards conclusion here. Our question at the beginning that we set out to talk about was, why does the UN criticize Israel so much? And the case we've tried to put forward to you, it's not because Israel is the worst violator of human rights that's ever existed in the world. That's not true. As several of you have pointed out, there are human rights violations in many, many countries in the world. Some of them arguably worse than what you find in Israel. The issue here for the UN is that Israel occupies a very special place because it was created by the UN. That's not true of Myanmar. It's not true of Tibet. It's not true of anything. Those were pre-existing issues that the UN can and should and does deal with from time to time. What is special about Israel is that it was a creation by a UN UN General Assembly, and that creation was done on the basis of certain conditions. And those conditions, in the eyes of the UN, have not been respected. And over again, it comes back to the UN. Why is it that this hasn't been done? So I think it's not because it's worse than other countries. It's not because of anti-Semitism. It's a very simple reason. Israel is in violation of multiple UN resolutions, and that's why they have the situation today. I'm going to thank Michael Lynk for joining us today, bringing his amazing knowledge and expertise. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There were some very good questions raised. By the way, everybody who was registered for this event tonight will get a copy of the recording, so you can examine it again and share it with other people. I'll be doing a follow-up email to you, and we are anxious at the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine to be promoting more thoughtful discussion about the Israel-Palestine issue. I mentioned our next one in January will be on the Judaization of Jerusalem. We're also hoping to set up, probably in February, a discussion on Hamas. Who is Hamas? What do they want? Hamas clearly has some influence now in Palestinian politics. And so we're going to have a discussion with not some people from Hamas, but some people who are knowledgeable about it. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for spending an hour and a half with us tonight. And I look forward to having an opportunity to talk to you again. Again, Michael Lynk, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me. And thank you very much to the audience for listening, whether you were in agreement or not. I enjoyed reviewing your questions and your comments, and I hope this made all of us think with respect to how do we resolve this issue. It's not intractable, it's not impossible to resolve, and I don't think it's going to be resolved unless it's done through the lens of human rights and international law.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.